Imagine waking one morning to find that everything you've ever known is about to vanish. Your name, your faith, your family, your very existence erased from history itself. For millions of Christians living under Ottoman rule, this wasn't imagination, it was reality, and what happened to them remains one of the most deliberately obscured chapters in modern history. April 24, 1915, Constantinople. In the pre-dawn darkness, Ottoman police move through the Armenian quarter with lists in hand. They're not arresting criminals. They're rounding up poets, teachers, clergy, doctors, the intellectual heart of the Armenian Christian community. 250 of the empire's brightest minds disappear into the night. Most will never be seen again. Within days, the system that had governed Christian life in the Ottoman Empire for centuries would collapse into something far more sinister. For over 400 years, Christians in the Ottoman Empire lived under what historians call the millet system. It sounds almost benign when described in textbooks. Religious minorities were allowed to govern their own communities, maintain their churches, collect their own taxes, and follow their own religious laws. But beneath this veneer of tolerance lay a darker truth. Christians were dhimmi, protected people. Yes, but protected in the way one protects property. They paid special taxes for the privilege of existing. They couldn't testify against Muslims in court. They couldn't build churches that exceeded mosques in height. They couldn't ring bells too loudly. They had to step aside when Muslims passed on the street. And most devastating of all, they had to surrender their sons. The Devshirme system, implemented in the 14th century, required Christian families in the Balkans to give up 20% of their male children to the Ottoman state. These boys, some as young as 8 years old, were taken from their mothers, forcibly converted to Islam, and trained as either administrators or soldiers in the elite Janissary corps. Imagine being a Christian mother in 15th century Greece, watching Ottoman officials evaluate your son, knowing that if they choose him, you'll never see him again. Not as he was. If he survives, if he rises through the ranks, he might return as the very force that subjugates your people. The psychological warfare embedded in this system was profound. It turned Christian children into the instruments of Christian oppression. But the millet system, for all its inequalities, at least provided a framework. Communities could worship. Families could stay together. Churches remained standing. That fragile arrangement began to crumble in the 19th century as the Ottoman Empire weakened and nationalism spread through Europe. The empire had lost nearly all its European territories by 1914, and with each loss came waves of Muslim refugees fleeing Christian lands, carrying stories of atrocities committed against them. The resentment festered, the desire for revenge grew, and Christian minorities within the empire became scapegoats for Ottoman humiliation. The Hamidian massacres of 1894 to 1896 offered a preview of horrors to come. Between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenian Christians were killed in systematic pogroms across the empire. Villages burned, churches desecrated, women violated, children orphaned. European powers condemned the violence, but took no meaningful action. The Ottomans learned an important lesson from this silence. If you're feeling the weight of this history, I understand. These aren't easy stories to hear, but they're vital stories to remember. If this matters to you, if you believe that bearing witness to the past helps prevent future atrocities, please subscribe. Help make sure these forgotten voices aren't silenced again. By 1915, the stage was set for catastrophe. The Ottoman Empire had entered World War I on the losing side. After a devastating defeat at the Battle of Sarkamis in January 1915, Ottoman leaders needed someone to blame. They chose the Armenians. Within months, what began as targeted arrests transformed into systematic annihilation. Armenian soldiers serving in the Ottoman army were disarmed, transferred to labor battalions, and then systematically murdered. They were the first to die, but they wouldn't be the last. Through the spring and summer of 1915, deportation orders went out across the empire. Armenian communities, some that had existed for 3,000 years, were given hours to pack what they could carry. Then they were marched into the desert to die. The deportations were death marches disguised as relocation. Tens of thousands of Armenians, mostly women, children, and elderly since the men had already been killed or conscripted, were driven hundreds of miles through mountains and deserts toward Syria. There was no destination, that was the point. Ottoman authorities knew that most wouldn't survive the journey. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were left where they fell. Those who begged for water received none. Irregular forces and local Kurds attacked the columns, killing, looting, abducting. It was sanctioned chaos. The few who reached the Syrian desert found no refuge, only concentration camps where starvation finished what the march had begun. The evidence of what happened is overwhelming. German nurses serving with Ottoman forces documented the atrocities. 1. Armin Wegner risked arrest to photograph the deportations, the dead and dying lining the roads, the children's bodies in the streets, the hollow eyes of survivors. American missionaries sent desperate cables home describing scenes they could barely comprehend. Henry Morgenthau, the United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, wrote that the entire history of the human race contained no episode as horrible as what he witnessed. By May 1915, even while the genocide was still unfolding, the Triple Entente, Russia, Britain, and France, formally condemned the Ottoman Empire for crimes against humanity and civilization. But condemnation without action is just words. The killing continued. By 1917, when the intentional massacres finally slowed, the damage was irreversible. Of the approximately 1.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire in 1915, at least 664,000 and possibly as many as 1.2 million had perished. The Armenian population of eastern Anatolia, a region they had inhabited for millennia, was effectively erased. Entire towns that had been Armenian for centuries were emptied, their churches destroyed or converted, their cemeteries plowed under, their presence systematically removed from maps and records. It wasn't just the murder of a people. It was the murder of memory itself, the international community knew. That's what makes the silence afterwards so devastating. Western newspapers covered the deportations extensively. Witness testimonies were published in books that circulated widely. Near East Relief, an American humanitarian organization, raised over $110 million, over $2 billion in today's currency, to aid Armenian refugees and orphans. Thousands of Armenians were adopted by Western families. The world saw, the world knew, and then the world chose to forget. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed and became the Republic of Turkey in 1923, the new government adopted a policy of denial that continues to this day. They dismissed charges of genocide, claimed the deaths were unfortunate byproducts of war, blamed Armenian illusionaries for provoking violence, and systematically destroyed evidence of what had occurred. The genocide didn't target only Armenians, though they bore the greatest losses. Assyrian Christians and Greek Orthodox communities suffered similar fates during this period, part of a broader campaign to transform the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman Empire into a more homogeneous Turkish nation-state. By the end of World War I, more than 90% of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were gone, along with hundreds of thousands of other Christians. The demographic transformation was stark and deliberate. Historians estimate that between 1914 and 1923, the Christian population of what would become Turkey fell from roughly 20% to less than 2%. That scale of change doesn't happen through migration or natural causes. It happens through systematic elimination. What haunts me most about this history is just the scale of death, though that's staggering enough. It's the precision, the bureaucratic efficiency, the way that human beings were reduced to entries in ledgers, processed through administrative systems designed for their destruction. Ottoman officials kept meticulous records of deportations, cataloging where communities were being sent, tracking the movement of convoys, documenting the distribution of confiscated property. They approach genocide the way other governments approach tax collection, with forms and procedures and careful notation. That cold efficiency reveals something terrifying about human nature. Atrocity doesn't require rage or passion. Sometimes it just requires indifference and organization. The legacy of these events echoes through our present moment. The Armenian diaspora, scattered across dozens of countries on every continent, exists because home was taken from them. The descendants of survivors carry intergenerational trauma, the weight of stories that had to be told in whispers because denial was official policy. And the pattern established here, a government targeting its own citizens based on ethnicity and religion, then denying it ever happened, has repeated itself in genocides since Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur. Each time, the international community promises never again, and each time, the promise rings hollow because we never truly confronted the first time. So, why does this matter now, more than a century later? Because memory is resistance. Because denial is a second death, an attempt to kill the victims again by erasing their suffering from history. Because when we refuse to name genocide for what it is, we make the next one easier to commit. The Ottoman treatment of Christian minorities, particularly during the Armenian genocide, stands as one of history's clearest examples of state-sponsored ethnic cleansing. It was systematic, it was intentional, it was documented by countless witnesses, and it deserves to be remembered, not sensationalized, but honestly acknowledged for the calculated destruction it was. The survivors who rebuilt their lives in exile, who preserved their language and faith and culture despite everything, who insisted on remembering when the world wanted to forget, they are the true heroes of this story. Their resilience in the face of erasure reminds us that history belongs not to those who try to bury it, but to those who refuse to let it die. In the comments below, share your thoughts. Have you heard this history before? What responsibility do we have to remember atrocities committed generations ago? And how do we honor the victims without exploiting their suffering? These are questions worth wrestling with, because the answers shape what kind of world we leave behind.